thank you so much for the invitation. Also, thank you, Abel, for the idea and the invitation as well. I think this is a great idea to bring some people to talk together about second scholasticism, early modern scholasticism in Europe, and of course also in Latin America, since in many regards this is something like a common project. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I will share a PowerPoint presentation. Can you see that? Okay, yes. Fine. I will do in this way. It's going to be easier for me if I basically read my text, so I can really be able to use only 30 minutes. And I will make use of some slides, not many. I'm sorry I didn't translate any of them actually into English. One or two are in Spanish, most of them in Latin. But let's see what we can do in the time we have. So thank you so much. So I start. Jerónimo Valera was born in Peru, 1568, in the locality of Nieva. He was educated first at the renowned Jesuit College of San Martin in Lima from 1583 to 1587, where he learned Latin grammar, rhetoric, logic, and the other liberal arts. But he became in 1588 a Franciscan, having taken the habit in the convent of St. Francis of Lima. At the same convent, Valera acted as lector of sacred theology and arts for 16 years, and there he died 1625. In the Franciscan Chronicles, Valera is characterized as an outstanding preacher and learned scholar who possessed a thorough knowledge of the thought of John Duns Scotus. His main work is at once a remarkable testimony of study of philosophy in Latin America at the beginning of the 17th century, and is a witness to the reception, influence, and development of Scotus thought in the intellectual circles of the viceroyalty of Peru. Valera's surviving work, titled Commentarii a quaestiones in universam Aristotelis ac Subtilissimi Doctoris Ioannis Scoti logicam, published 1610, was the first work of philosophy printed in South America, and apparently also the first work in philosophy to be written by a criollo, that is, a son of Spanish colonizers born in the discovered land. The work was intended to be a textbook of logic for Franciscan friars, and it was not designed for university classes, strictly speaking. In the study houses of the order in the 16th century, there were usually one lecture of St. Bonaventure and one of Scotus. At any rate, the convent of St. Francis in Lima offered also a third chair in theology dedicated to Aquinas. In fact, according to Cordova Salinas in the Studia at that important convent, there were 6 courses in scholastic theology, including moral theology, the 3 disciplines of the cursus philosophicus, that is logic, philosophy of nature, and metaphysics, 1 course in grammar, and still others. The followers of Valera in the teaching of the Scotist doctrine were Miguel Ribera, of whom we don't know much, and Alfonso Briceño, who in the year 1639 published 2 remarkable volumes of controversiae concerning Scotus questions in primum librum sententiarum. Alfonso Briceño was probably a pupil of Valera in the first decade of the 17th century. So just to have an image of the convent of St. Francis in Lima. Lima is always cloudy, but it never rains there. The presentation that follows is divided in 3 parts. First, I characterize Valera's work as a logica in via Scoti. After analyzing the structure of his work, I argued that the surviving volume contains only the first part of a 2-part project, the second part of which presumably required another volume. Second, I discussed the contents of his first volume on logic, comparing with some editions of Scotus Logicalia. I again divided this second part into some preliminary accounts of the nature of logic according to Jerónimo Valera. Let's say something about his logica in via Scoti. Latin American colonial philosophy was essentially realized by members of the religious orders. It is well documented that professors of philosophy produced cursus, summae, and treatises which survive in printed or manuscript form. Most of the authors made use of Aristotelian works as the basis for logical education. Summulistic and Aristotelian logic were studied continuously, and so the minor logic and the greater logic constitute the logical literature. The greater logic included study and commentary on Porphyry's Isagoge, Aristotle's categories, and posterior analytics, and quite often on the topics and the sophistical refutations. Depending on how extensively they had been treated in the Summulae, whose structural form for 16th, 17th century logicians was originally given by Domingo de Soto. Commentaries on the Interpretazione and the prior analytics might be included or not to the corpus of the greater logic as well. Valera's work on logic fits perfectly in this general picture. After all, the extant volume of his writing testifies to the double structure of his logical cursus, for it treats the Summulae dialecticae, or the minor logic, and offers Commentarii ac quaestiones on the organon of Aristotle. This structure, which with some variations, had been richly verified by Walter Redmond and Mauricio Bechot in the logical works by such authors as the Augustinian Fray Alonso de la Vera Cruz in his Recognitio Summularum and Dialectica Resolutio 1554, and the Jesuit Antonio de la Rueda Rubio in his Commentarii in Universam Aristotelis Dialecticam 1603. Truly, according to my own research, it can be verified in all Latin American cursus on logic found so far, either as manuscript or printed work. The title of Valera's work specifies that it is a Scotist logic, again, Commentarii a quaestiones in universam logica, in universam Aristotelis, ac subtilissimi Doctoris Ioannis dum Scoti, logicam. It seems that Valera and his Peruvian confreres were conscious of this novelty in the teaching of logic. The publication of Valera's book by a leading publisher in Lima, Franciscus del Canto, was enabled by 4 approbaciones in Spanish and Latin written by officials within the order. The approbation by Fray Diego de Pineda especially clarifies the purpose of Valera's logica in via Scoti. I just highlight that Fray Diego declares the work of Valera as the first logic in via Scoti that had originated within the Franciscan order. Whether this means in the order as a whole or only in the Americas is unclear. Céspedes Agüero believes that it was the first logic in via Scoti outside of Europe, but he does not prove or explain his claim. It is possible that Valera's was the first logica in via Scoti, or at least the first early modern complete and combined cursus of minor and greater logic anywhere. There is no indication of a logic like this in the Scotistic bibliographical work by Uriel Smets. In what sense is Valera's text a logic in via Scoti? As to the Summulae dialecticae, although Scotus did not write any work in this genre, Valera constantly refers to Scotus' works, authentic or not, in his exposition of the doctrine of terms, propositions, and consequences. Moreover, Valera teaches a Scotist logic in the sense that he relies on Scotus' thought to interpret the greater logic of Aristotle. At the beginning of each distinction, he usually quotes a text of Aristotle and another by Scotus, meant to guide the interpretation of Aristotle and to orient his treatment of the logical issue. Finally, Valera's work is a logica in via Scoti in that he presupposes, discusses, and expands opinions of Scotus not only from his Logicalia, but from his other writings, namely the Quaestiones in Libros Metaphysicorum, Ordinatio, Reportationes, and Quod Liberta. Thus, Valera's work in Via Scoti expounds philosophical theses of Scotus in philosophy of language and metaphysics as well as logic. According again to Céspedes Agüero, of the 56 authors whom Valera cites, he refers most often, of course, to Aristotle and Scotus. Interestingly, Antonio Rubio, whose own Commentarii appeared in Alcalá in 1603, is the third most often cited author, followed by Francisco Murcia de la Llana, the author of Selecta circa Aristotelis Dialecticam Subtilioris Doctrinae, printed in Madrid in 1604. Why is this information interesting? Well, the book by Valera was published 1610. It means that in Lima, far away from Europe, he was very much updated. He had access to editions of Scotus' works published before 1639, before the edition by Luke Wadding. As it is well known, today scholars recognize the following logical works as authentic: Quaestiones in Librum Porphyrii Isagoge, Quaestiones super Predicamenta Aristotelis, Quaestiones in Libros peri Hermenias Aristotelis, and Quaestiones super Librum Elencorum Aristotelis. Valera, however, took as authored by Scotus some works that have since been proved to be spurious, including questions on the prior analytics composed in the mid-14th century and questions on the posterior analytics now known to have been written by John of Cornwall in the beginning of the 14th century. He sometimes refers to Scotus' comments on the topics, but we do not know if he is referring to some commentary. The existing volume of Valera's work is divided into 3 sections: Summulae, Liber Primus, and Liber Secundus. The Liber Primus is structured around an authentic Scotus work, Quaestiones in Libros Porphyrii Isagoge, and the Liber Secundus is structured around another authentic work, Quaestiones super Predicamenta. The frontispiece of the volume announces that this is the first part of a complete logic divided in 2 parts. Let's pay some attention to this frontispiece. The subtitle on the frontispiece of Valera's Commentarii announces that, reading in Latin, totum hoc opus in 2 partes distributum offertur, prima continet breve quodam logicae compendium, quod vulgo solet summa seu Summulae dialecticae nunc occupari, quaestiones prolegomenales predicabilia Porphyrii et Aristotelis ante predicamenta et post predicamenta. The first part is divided into 3 sections. The first is a compendium of logic, which includes a brief discussion of the art of dialectic and the object and nature of the Summulae in 36 pages. The second session of Liber Primus consists in a commentary in via Scoti on Porphyries Isagoge. Here, in distinctions 1 and 2, Valera investigates the nature of the predicables, their properties, and the nature of the universal in common. In distinctions 3 to 8, he treats the 5 kinds of universals. In the third section of the first part, the Liber Secundus, he first explains the pre-predicaments, or the main modes of predication for signifying terms, namely univocity, equivocity, analogy, and denomination, then the predicaments, or the 10 categories, and finally the post-predicaments, or the relationships that the categories have among themselves, such as anteriority, simultaneity, and especially opposition. In the Liber Primus and Liber Secundus, Valera frequently quotes 2 of Scotus' authentic works, quaestiones in libros porphyris agoge and quaestiones super predicamenta. But the frontispiece also announces the contents of a second part of the complete logic. Reading in Latin, secunda pax librus peri Hermeniarum pseudo interpretatione librus priorum posteriorum topicorum et elencorum comprehendit. The second part comprises books 3 to 7 of the work. The tertius concerns the interpretatione, the quartus the analytica priora, the quintus the analytica posteriora, the sextus the topica, and the septimus the elenchi. In short, the second part of Valera's work contained, or was meant to contain, complete treatment of the greater logic of Aristotle. In this treatment, Valera could have relied on authentic commentaries by Scotus on Perihermenias and the Elenchi, and presumably on spurious commentaries on the prior and posterior analytics and perhaps the topics. That Valera intended a complete logica in via Scoti, comprising both the minor and the greater logics, is clearly stated in the preface to the Commentarii ac quaestiones. But the volume of Valera's Commentarii ac quaestiones, exemplars of which are preserved in several libraries in South America and elsewhere, a rare book because it was published in Lima, does not contain anything of the announced second part. I could not find any reference to a 2-volume work or a volume actually containing the 2 parts in any catalogs that I consulted. That the contents of books 3 to 7 are not somehow contained in Libri 1 and 2 of the existing volume, but was written anyhow indeed, is confirmed by the preface to the Liber Secundus, which states explicitly the topics of his work that are pursued in 8 distinctions. In sum, Valera's commentaries on the works listed as being treated in the second part of his comprehensive logic either were only intended and never actually written, or they exist only in manuscript and were not printed, or they are simply lost. Would be wonderful to find it. That there may indeed have been a second volume of the Commentarii ac quaestiones, which is not preserved, is also indicated by the fact that the existing volume has no table of contents, which was possibly prepared for the end of a second volume. Let's say something now about Jerónimo Valera on dialectic. I now describe texts from the opening session of Valera's Summulae dialecticae and from the Liber Primus. They are helpful to understand his account of logic as a science. Valera considers Aristotle to be the prince of the peripatetics and the inventor of the art of dialectic. Dialectic is neither easy nor elementary. Consequently, for beginners, one must develop an art for elucidating the difficult doctrines of Aristotle. Summulae are, in fact, a compendium or a rude and imperfect image of all of the parts of logic contained in the organon. The goal of teaching in the Summulae, however, is not only to acquaint students with the Aristotelian books and facilitate the understanding of them, but also to instruct the students in the method of disputing. Apprentices must first of all become dialecticae and eventually learn to get into disputes more dialectical. Valera divides the Summulae into 3 parts, which correspond with the 3 operations of the intellect. 1, the simple apprehension of things or of simple terms, which is the basis for the composition or division of simple things apprehended in an affirmative or negative proposition, which leads to discourse, whereby from one proposition another is inferred. He shows no concern for the psychology of these 3 fundamental intellectual operations, but only for the logical linguistic form and typology that each operation presents. As Aristotle says, the proper subject of dialectic is the art of drawing correct conclusions from valid argumentation, or, in sum, the method or the art of reasoning. Valera's concerns are really didactic. He exposes in detail the definitions of dialectica as an art of reasoning, and he remains very close to Domingo de Soto in that regard. The word dialectica, which stays for faculty, comes from the Greek dialegomē. This etymology indicates that dialectic in Valera's mind is not confined to the logic of the topics. The Greek origin of the word comprehends both the topical and demonstrative part of logic. He prefers a more comprehensive meaning of the term, and I quote him about the purpose of dialectic: to make evident unknown things from known things through argumentation, be it probable or necessary. Another term for the art is logica, coming from the Greek logos, which means discourse or reason, which comprehends both verbal and mental discourse. He turns next to a series of questions about the arts of dialectics. What are the causes of dialectic? The causes here is natural. Human reason itself gives rise to disputation, for there is a certain native power of inquiring and responding. Dialectic grew through application, studium, but it attained its highest perfection in the art of disputation. So an important question in Valera's Summulae is where to begin the teaching of logic. Summulists are not unanimous about the order of topics in logic. Some say that the art of logic begins with the way of knowing, modus sciendi, or the discourse that manifests some unknown thing. Since there are three causes for things turning to be known, the way of knowing is threefold. An unknown thing may be known through the vision, definition, and through argumentation, in which case from a known property an unknown is deduced. Here, the modus sciendi is the oratio, which seems to amount to or to be summarized in the very notion of consequence or valid argument, which certainly presupposes the several parts of the argument. If this is the beginning of dialectics, it cannot begin with authority experienced without determinate rules and techniques or examples that manifest unknown things only accidentally. Here, to begin with the modus sciendi, or strict valid argumentation in logic, is to begin already through the most universal instrument of the intellect, into which everything else in the ratio of the intelligible is then directed. This, as Valera especially and in many details explores in the several questions of the first distinction of his Liber Primus, is the syllogism. There is, however, a second opinion about the starting point of dialectic, according to which the art begins not through the modus sciendi itself, but through a more simple part of it, namely the knowledge of terms. Indeed, Aristotle seems to have assumed that dialectic begins with a knowledge of terms, or even more simply, the term. The order of doctrine, as every art, follows an order of nature, and nature makes progress from potency to act, from part to whole, from simple things to composed things, etc. So, grammar confirms this, since the students begin with the knowledge of terms in the form of grammar classifications, such as noun, verb, etc. Moreover, the more simple and first things, the parts, are easier to know, for they are more independent. Finally, the logician has to conduct, first of all, the intellectual operation that is previous and independent, and this is the apprehension of the terms. Valera endorses the second opinion about the starting point of the study of dialectic. In fact, the universal instruments of the intellect, which consist of universal laws and serve all investigative undertakings, are presented in scientific form in the logica magna that follows the Summulae that is, the books with commentaries in via Scoti on Aristotle's logical works. But in the compendium that precedes these books, one must obtain just some knowledge of how to reason correctly before proceeding to more complex operations. The compendium offers a confused, imperfect knowledge of the way of knowing, and there is no reason why one should introduce it with yet another confused compendium ad infinitum. Surely, one cannot acquire a distinct knowledge of the way of knowing without divisions and definitions. But in order to make these divisions and definitions, one must know more simply, vaguely, what a definition, a division, a consequence, and so on is. It is necessary to begin the study of logic at some point, and for that purpose, a knowledge of such terms as division, definition, etc., which one possesses through the guiding nature, through the sharpness of natural logic, is sufficient. Furthermore, for the disciple, it is enough to apprehend vaguely the way of knowing transmitted by the master. Thus, confidence plays an important role so that the student may assume that what he is learning is exact and true. In sum, the point of departure for the study of dialectic are the still vague notions that one possesses through a kind of natural logical intelligence. At a further passage in his text, our master says that in order to acquire knowledge of logic, one initially cannot and need not to attain the way of knowing in the assigned or signified act, but only in the exerted act. This is what the beginner realizes by making use of the definition offered by the master. This is what, and there is, of course, a didactical principle here and an obvious didactical concern. Before he comprehends clearly the very subject matter of logic, the apprentice just has to follow what the master makes in the procedures of the discipline. And this is basically Valera's justification for the Summulae. But let's now pay some attention to a further text, the Proemium to the Liber Primus. In the Proemium, Valera explains the plan of his commentary on Aristotelian logic and why it can be viewed as a Scotist logic. It is especially interesting to see how he constructs the commentary to the perfect understanding of Aristotle's logic and orients it, first of all, through Scotus' quaestiones in Librus Porphyrii Isagogae. I put it. Yeah. Thus, in the first distinction on the nature and properties of logic, he repeats three questions posed by the subtle doctor, namely, whether logic is a science, whether logic is a common science, and what is the object of logic. Quoting Scotus literally, Valera follows his conclusions. First, he emphasizes that logic is a science, for in logic many things are concluded through demonstration, and actually it deals with all things required for demonstration. Second, logic must be considered insofar as it is docens, in this case it is a science, and insofar as it is utens, in this case it is not a science. He asserts that logic is a common science according to its obiectum because it is used in the learning of all other sciences. Third, he reminds his readers that according to Scotus, there are three conditions of the subjectum of a science. One has to know what it is and that it is. Through the knowledge of what it is, one can demonstrate the properties of the subject. All other things in the science are reduced to its subject and are considered because of it. According to these conditions, Valera affirms that a being of reason in common is the proper subjectum of logic, and this is the syllogism. The syllogism satisfies all of the conditions for being the adequate subject of logic. All questions raised by Valera keep this thesis in view, as you can read in handout number 8. Moreover, We should stress that if the first object of metaphysics for Valera is real being, ens reale, which is the transcendental ens qua ens, understood and defined by Valera very much in Suarez terms, that is, the being that can exist in the nature of things. A being of reason, ens rationis, on its turn, has a diminished existence, which the thing acquires only when it is under cognition. There is, for example, such an ens when human being, homo, is known as subject, predicate, or species. This is not real a parte re, but only because the intellect creates that with regard to cognize human being. A being of reason has a being invented by the intellect grounded on the likeness of the real thing, of the real being. From such an orientation provided by Scotus' questions and conclusions, Valera's detailed exposition on the nature and properties of logica in the Liber Primus of the Commentarii will be offered in 10 different questions. A simple attempt to find a structure and a sequence for his questions and rather complex expositions would have to at least include an account of the real basis of logic as a habit of knowledge, an account of the object of logic, as well as an account of the scientific character of logic as intellectual habit. If you allow me, for the sake of brevity, I will only offer a short description of Valera's account of the real basis of logic, which seems to be a rather Scotist discussion on the nature of logic and its relationship to the knowledge of reality, instead of a purely restatement of a theoretical question found in Scotus' distinctions. I will be very short here. In a kind of meta-theoretical consideration, beginning his commentary on question 1 of distinction 1, whether dialectics is in the nature of things, Valera emphasizes that theoretically the question about what a thing is always precedes any questions about the way in which it is. What concerns Valera most in this instance is the question whether something is, that is, in our case, whether dialectic has true existence, either actual or possible, in the nature of things. He affirms that logic does not investigate properly the nature of truth and falsehood, as metaphysics does, and does not simply judge on the truth and credibility of its object, as all the sciences do, but rather considers the form by which one judges concerning the truth of things. He sees no inconsistency in affirming that with regard to the true form of judging about what and how things truly are, there is an art in nature indeed that discerns truth from falsehood. Although falsehoods may be defined as the privation of truth, he denies that privation signifies nothing. Although privation is not something positive, there is, however, in nature a reale privativum. That logic exists in the nature of things seems to amount, in the end, to the idea that logical form depends directly on mind's acts, but indirectly and originally on first intentional concepts, and thus on the ways things are. Before the conclusion, Valera further stresses 2 points. The most commonly accepted division of logic or dialectic is into natural, inchoative, and artificial logic. Natural dialectic is the intellect itself, which, guided by the natural light, defines, divides, and argues. Human beings can perform these acts through the simple guidance of nature alone. Inchoative dialectic is the knowledge of some evident consequences discerned by the intellect, at least in the perfect modes of the first syllogistic figure. Artificial logic is a habit acquired through frequent use of argumentation. It is the nature of this sort of logic or dialectic that Valera strives to investigate and understand. Every art has been invented to perfect things that nature leaves imperfect and inchoative, or to perfect the potencies that are inclined to enact that sometimes is made well, sometimes not. He concludes that logic is not only possible, but it is given de facto. It is possible because operations of the intellect can be realized well or badly. This allows the conclusion that such operations can be ordered by some art to a good performance. One can therefore say that there is an offer of nature that a corresponding art is givable, dabilis est, for the purpose of providing a way and method for the excellent realization of those operations. And also we experienced before learning dialectics that to define, to divide, and to argue are difficult things. Once we acquire the art of logic, however, we define, divide, and argue quite easily. Why did I choose this last point? Just to show this. It is a logic ad mentem Scoti, and in many senses, it is absolutely interesting to follow it for a better understanding of Scotus himself, as for example, about Scotus' thesis that the object of logic is syllogism, adequate object of logic. But also very important to realize that even though he is very much willing to understand Aristotle ad mentem Scoti, Valera is discussing things like whether dialectic exists in the nature of things that are examples of questions that were not posed by Scotus himself. So he's discussing with the very intellectual atmosphere of the 16th, 17th century about questions shared by intellectuals from the Jesuit order, the Dominican order, or of course the Franciscan tradition. Scotus' logic in South America is commentary on Scotus, but it is also development of Scotus. So it is Scotism. The history of Scotism has in South America a very important chapter, and perhaps the very first Scotus logic in the 16th, 17th century way was indeed written in the continent, in the South American continent. Thank you so much for your attention. That's it.